Superhumanize. Accelerated evolution.
I have had the pleasure of following Dr. Georgia Eade's groundbreaking work for a while now, and her insights into the connection between nutrition and mental health have continually impressed me. Dr. Eade is a Harvard-trained psychiatrist with over 2 decades of clinical experience, specializing in nutritional psychiatry and brain metabolism. Her personal journey and professional expertise have led her to uncover powerful dietary strategies that can transform mental health, which she has detailed in her newly released book, Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind. Dr. Eade's work has significantly advanced our understanding of how specific dietary interventions, particularly the ketogenic diet, can profoundly influence psychiatric disorders. Today, she's here to discuss her new book and to share the biochemical mechanisms behind these interventions and practical applications for improving cognitive function and emotional well-being. Whether you're curious about the role of specific nutrients in brain health or how to implement these dietary changes in your own life, I promise this conversation will be both enlightening and actionable. Georgia, welcome to the Superhumanize podcast. I am so happy we get to connect today.
Me too. Thank you so much for inviting me, Ariana.
Oh, absolutely. I got my attention put on your work by your book that you published this year, Change Your Diet, Change Your Mind, and you have for quite a while done some revolutionary work. We'll talk about the book in more detail as well. I would like to highlight in the beginning that your work on the ketogenic diet for mental health has been absolutely groundbreaking from what I garner. And your analysis shows that there's huge improvement for patients who are dealing with some serious mental illness, that when you switch diets, you can get people healthier. And this, of course, has incredible implications for the future of psychiatric treatments. I would love to start this conversation, Georgia, with asking you to elaborate on, just giving us an overview and then also going into elaborating on the mechanisms through which ketogenic diets influence brain metabolism and also mental health.
Great. Thanks for starting off with that as the beginning point of our conversation, because I think that is really the headline. So really the headline is, because there are lots of other things we could talk about, and we may, but what I love about you starting off with this is that ketogenic diets, people often think about ketogenic diets as a weight loss diet, or they may think about a ketogenic diet as a meat-heavy diet, or they might think about a ketogenic diet as having lots of saturated fat or dairy fat in it. And none of those things need to be true about the ketogenic diet. So yes, it can help you lose weight, but it can also, depending on how you construct it, it could help you maintain a healthy weight or help you even gain weight. It can include animal foods. It doesn't have to include animal foods. And the beautiful thing about a ketogenic diet is that it's really not about plants and animals. It's about shifting your metabolism into this lower insulin mode so that essentially it changes your brain's operating system and the rest of your metabolism as well in these really powerful ways. And so everyone, regardless of their dietary preferences, can access that special state of mind. And I think that's why I'm so excited that you invited me on, because I really want to make sure that everybody has access to these interventions. The reason why I became focused, why such a large focus of my work is the ketogenic diet, is because as a psychiatrist, I haven't found any other tool that's been this powerful in terms of helping people, sometimes even people with very serious or long-standing mental illnesses, or from minor to major mental health concerns, people who've taken lots of different types of medications, people who've been in and out of the hospital, people who have lost jobs or had their life interrupted by mental health concerns. Sometimes within days to weeks of changing their diet in this way, they can experience profound improvements in their total brain health and body health. And so I'm really excited to share that information with people, because a lot of people think they've already tried everything. And most people have not. Most people have not tried. There are a variety of different dietary interventions in the book that I share with people, but the one that really is the most powerful is this concept of shifting into ketosis. Thank you for starting us off there.
Yes, no, absolutely, Georgia. And so for us to understand better how a ketogenic diet actually impacts brain metabolism, specifically, I would like to know, how do ketones impact neurotransmitter balance and also inflammation?
Yes. So when you change your lifestyle to lower your insulin levels, so this can be by eating less food in general, the different ways to get into ketosis. So it could be either through a particular fasting protocol, or it could be through really significant calorie restriction combined with exercise, or it could be through a low carbohydrate, higher fat diet. Again, whether plant or animal based, what happens is when you lower your insulin levels to the point that fat burning switches on, insulin levels have to be below a certain point in order for your body to burn fat for energy. So when they come down to that point, fat burning switches on. And then when you're burning fat vigorously, some of that fat gets chopped into small fragments called ketones. And these dissolve in the bloodstream. The liver is where most of them are made. And so the liver will chop these longer fat molecules into these little pieces, these little fragments called ketones. These dissolve in the blood and they circulate throughout your brain and body, and they cross into the brain easily, and they help energize the brain. So glucose or sugar, blood sugar, the brain does need some glucose at all times, but it also can use and likes to actually use often a mix of ketones and glucose, like a hybrid engine. So it's just another source of energy. When you bring your glucose levels down and you bring your insulin levels down, what you're doing is you're taking a lot of pressure off of your brain's metabolism, and you're shifting it into this quieter mode where more healing can take place, where less inflammation and less what's called oxidative stress is taking place. We're often told to eat more antioxidants, foods with more antioxidants and antioxidant supplements, but we're often not thinking about, okay, what's causing all that oxidative stress in the first place? It's the high sugar, high insulin diet. So overeating in general, eating too many of the wrong carbohydrates too often, not exercising, eating too frequently, all of those things, even overeating protein, can keep insulin levels too high to allow fat burning to take place and allow this healing mode to allow you to enter this healing mode. You asked about neurotransmitter and brain chemistry balance. So when you're eating in an unhealthy way, which is, and this can happen to anybody, in fact, it's really common for people to eat what I like to say is too many of the wrong foods too often, particularly the refined carbohydrates and the vegetable oils, which are in all the ultra-processed foods, sugars and cereal products and flours and any kind of packaged food that has a vegetable oil in it. Vegetable oils are things like soybean oil and sunflower oil and safflower oil. These are not whole plant fats. These are factory fats. So those industrialized ingredients, they're really powerful promoters of inflammation and oxidative stress in the brain. So when you're eating this way, you're getting these waves. You're getting a glucose spike, a big glucose spike in your bloodstream if you're eating the wrong carbohydrates, too many of those too often. Then you're getting a big insulin spike to deal with all that glucose coming in, the sugar that's coming in. And your brain sugar is spiking as well. So you're getting, if you're eating the wrong, a big spike in blood sugar, then a big spike in brain sugar, a big spike in blood insulin. And so you've set up this kind of roller coaster throughout the rest of the day and early into the night where things are going to be unstable. Too much glucose in the brain, waves of inflammation and oxidative stress. And that's that's very physically damaging to the brain. And when you flood the brain with too much glucose, more than it needs, it does need glucose, but it doesn't need very much. So if you're taking in more than it needs and you're getting these spikes in brain glucose, those glucose molecules, the extra glucose, will literally stick to very important components throughout the brain and twist them into these caramelized clusters, these sticky clusters that don't function
Mm.
And so that's called advanced glycation end products. That sets off a wave of inflammation and oxidative stress in the brain. The immune system sets off these alarms. That, and this gets to your question, I had to go through a few hoops to get there. So high brain sugar, advanced glycation end products, these caramelized clusters, waves of inflammation and oxidative stress to deal with these clusters that are just triggered by these clusters. And then what you get is the inflammation and oxidative stress throw all your neurotransmitter systems out of balance. You can see lower serotonin levels, lower melatonin levels, higher dopamine levels, lower GABA levels, and skyrocketing levels of a neurotransmitter, a brain chemical called glutamate. We think a lot about serotonin and dopamine, but glutamate is a very important neurotransmitter. So when you've got too much inflammation and oxidative stress, whether from eating the wrong way or from smoking or from drinking alcohol, you can see your glutamate levels go sky high, up to 100 times what they normally would be. And that glutamate is not just, it overstimulates the brain. It's like a brain's gas pedal. It can cause anxiety. It can cause mild manic symptoms, insomnia, irritability, brain's in overdrive when there's too much glutamate. And that's just one example of how eating the wrong way can directly and very profoundly destabilize brain chemistry. And so when you go on a ketogenic diet, the glucose levels naturally come down to it and they stay in a nice healthy range. The insulin levels also come down, stay in a nice healthy range. And when the insulin levels come down, you can start burning fat and making ketones and supporting brain energy. So the problem with eating if you're eating a high sugar, high insulin diet for many years, it can gradually restrict your brain's ability to turn that glucose into energy. So it sounds upside down, but the more sugary your diet is over time, the harder it is for your brain to use that sugar for energy.
Yes, and that also ties. Thank you for explaining this, Georgia. And from my personal layperson / biohacker's experience,
yes, thank you.
What you're talking about totally makes sense. I feel best when I stay away from these very starchy type processed foods. Every once in a while, you're traveling or you're celebrating something, and that's what you celebrate with. I feel the impact pretty much within very shortly, and it stays with me for the next 24 to 48 hours. So whether that's a feeling of unease, brain fog, symptoms of anxiety or such, I am 95% plant-based, focused on whole foods, and focused on not a ketogenic diet, but one that really has very low, especially refined carbohydrate intake. And that has served me best. I'm sure I can optimize this even more so following your guidelines. And what you just explained, Georgia, that what fascinated me in your book also is this concept of type 3 diabetes, where this insulin resistance in the brain impairs, as you just explained, the glucose utilization, and which shows a very clear link between diet and cognitive decline. And I think this idea is so relevant, especially if we look at the rising rates of dementia and diabetes, which we're faced with right now.
Exactly. So much to respond to there. And I want to make sure that I respond first to what you were just sharing about your own experience with food, because this is a beautiful example of how eating a very clean whole foods diet, whether it's plant or animal based, will allow you to get more in touch with how eating the wrong way, eating the wrong foods affects you. So if it's only after you really clean up your diet to a significant extent that you can even tell the difference between when you're feeling really good and when you're not, because most of us don't feel good ever. Most people have come to accept a pretty low bar for mental health. They don't expect to be able to concentrate well. They crumble under stress and they feel unstable or easily irritable or hungry and irritable between meals, or they feel hungry all the time and feel like they can't control what they're eating, or they're sad, or they've got brain fog, whatever it is. And until you really substantially improve the quality of your diet and take all of these ultra-processed foods out, it's only then that you can see how they're affecting you. Because then none of us is perfect about our diet, including me. When you eat something that is less than optimal, you're going to notice it. And that's going to be a great teaching moment for you. It really, I get a good reminder. I get a good oh yeah, that's why I need to, that's why I need to be careful. And you've got that much cleaner baseline going. So then the other piece is this, okay, insulin resistance and Alzheimer's and type 3 diabetes. It is not normal for the brain to deteriorate with age. It is not normal for us to start having problems with our memory in our 40s and 50s and 60s, not even in our 70s. It's not normal. And we know it's not normal because it doesn't happen to most people. It's happening to a growing majority, to an ever-increasing number of us. It's still not the norm. And so that suggests that we can expect more. And if we understand what's driving the deterioration of the brain, the dying of the brain cells, if we understand what's killing them, then we can have a lot more control over our intellectual future. And what we've understood now for almost 20 years, that insulin resistance, which goes by a lot of names, insulin resistance, prediabetes, high insulin levels, metabolic syndrome, whatever you want to call it, lots of different things to call it. Essentially, if your insulin levels are running too high because your diet is demanding too much insulin, because you're either overeating in general or you're eating too many of the wrong carbohydrates too often, et cetera, et cetera. If your insulin levels are running too high too often, this is the opposite of what happens with glucose. So with glucose, with sugar in the blood, the higher the blood sugar, the higher the brain sugar. They rise and fall together. This is not the case with insulin. If your insulin levels are running too high too often, which they are for the majority now of Americans, have, depending on which study you look at and how you define it, anywhere between 52% of us and 93% of us have some degree of insulin resistance. So if that means our insulin levels are running too high too often. And when that happens, it becomes harder and harder for the brain to absorb insulin from the circulation. So because we're bombarding the surface of the brain with too much insulin, and so the brain becomes insulin resistant. It says, I need to tone down my response to insulin so that I don't get overstimulated by all this insulin. It's a natural response that the brain has. So then there's not enough insulin crossing into the brain, but there's still plenty of glucose crossing into the brain. This is a huge problem because the brain can't process glucose to full capacity without adequate insulin. And so now you've got a situation where this brain can be swimming in a sea of glucose and still be slowly starving to death. And that paves the path for type 3 diabetes, which is Alzheimer's disease, and lots of other mental health problems as well. We now know insulin resistance is strongly associated with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, major depression, anxiety in children with obesity, and lots of other psychiatric conditions. It's so easy if you have the right information to lower your insulin levels and your glucose levels and protect yourself. So this is one of the main reasons I wrote the book, was to help people see how much control they have over this process. You don't have to accept that as your destiny.
Yes, and I think that is so crucial, Georgia. People often feel victimized by their circumstances, victimized oftentimes also, as I hear right and left, by the medical system, where they don't feel heard, or they're just getting prescribed things that kind of, I don't know, it's like you patch up one symptom, but you don't get to the root cause. And nutrition is just absolutely fundamental. I'm really curious, how do you approach the integration of dietary intervention in treatment of psychiatric disorders in a clinical setting? And what challenges would one face convincing patients and also colleagues of the efficacy?
Yes. So I love this as it's a real world question, because we can talk about science and theory and how everything works till the cows come home. But unless you actually know how to changing diet is hard. Yeah. And sometimes even talking about changing diet is hard. Even sometimes even thinking about it is hard. And so it could be challenging in clinical practice. And it can also be challenging when I'm teaching other clinicians. So I teach other clinicians how to safely implement ketogenic diets in their clinical work. And we spend a lot of time in that course talking about how do you engage with people about dietary changes in ways that are respectful, in ways that are flexible, in ways that are encouraging and positive and motivating, rather than you should stop eating this and that sort of thing. And in ways that are really empowering. Really, this is about empowering people. And so I think one of the biggest challenges that when I first fell in love with nutrition science and wanted to do this for a living, this was a long time ago, 15 years ago, or even more at this point. I was so excited about it. I just couldn't wait. Every patient who walked into my office, I just wanted to talk to them about it. I made a lot of mistakes and I learned a lot of things. Nutrition can be a very delicate subject and a very personal subject. And A, not everybody wants to hear about it, but B, I think it's really important to understand somebody's relationship with food and whether or not they're willing to have that conversation before you launch in. And so there's the clinical setting where I offer it as an option. For years and years, I offered it as an option alongside medication. And now for the past 6 or 7 years, I have a 100% nutrition focused practice. So everyone coming to me now is already wanting to change their diet. But for years, I would say the majority of people who came to me did not want to change their diet. So I understand how hard it is, both as a clinician and as a human being. It was very hard for me to change my diet years ago. And I understand some of the challenges. So some of the challenges we come across are A, there's fear of letting go of certain foods that we're very attached to. And really, the number one is the refined carbohydrates, right? So people love, and I'm one of them, love sugary and starchy foods. And I'm not talking about starchy root vegetables and fruits. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about chocolate and ice cream and pizza and all of these things, things that we grew up with, have been eating for decades, and they're, for many of us, quite addictive. And it's hard to imagine our lives without these things. So I really view addiction to ultra-processed foods, and especially foods with a high glycemic index or that turn instantly into glucose in the body and give you that kind of rush. This can be starches or sugars, flours or sugars. I view that as my number one obstacle to helping people improve the quality of their diet. Because I hear people say things like, but Dr. Eid, I deserve chocolate. Or how I'll do anything, but I can't give up bread. Please. And that opens up an opportunity to explore the relationship between people and those particular foods that they're really attached to. But the other thing it does is it gives us an opportunity to have a conversation about how, while it might seem scary and maybe even impossible to imagine even a week without these kinds of foods in our lives, I've seen time and time, hundreds of times, that if you let go of them for a week or two, yes, the first few days may not be fun, but it really doesn't take long before your taste buds adapt, your hormones adapt, your metabolism adapts, your appetite comes down, the cravings fade, and you will not recognize yourself. Yeah, have you had this? You're nodding. It sounds like you've had this experience.
Oh, yes. And I have been optimizing my nutrition for so many years now, and I still have times, stressful times, or like I mentioned before, travel times, or like last year when I went to Florence with family. And find yourself eating, oh my, so good, and you're on vacation, and I will have pasta and pizza and pastries and all these things that I very rarely have, at the very least not in that highly processed form, and I'll have them multiple times a day. And all of a sudden, and I know the risk of it, of course, and I know that I will find myself in a craving state once I know, okay, this is for 2 weeks and then I'm going to get off that stuff again. Right. And it literally takes a few days. I feel miserable physically and psychologically. I've done this a few times in my life. Probably within a week, I'll start feeling better. And not only that, within 1 or 2 weeks, even thinking about eating something like that, my body goes, nah, that doesn't really sound tasty. Because your body recalibrates, and your body, after a while, it probably is different for different people. Every body is different, reacts differently. But I have found in my own experience, and also what I hear from friends and family, that once you focus on a really good, nutritious, whole foods diet without these ingredients that are not good for us, our body naturally wants more of the good.
Yes. And this is a very common experience. One of the things I try to help people make I try to help people connect the dots is it's not normal to be hungry every 2 or 3 hours unless you're really under eating. It's not normal to be hungry every 2 or 3 hours. We evolved to be able to go longer than that. How long would our species have lasted if we needed to eat every 2 to 3 hours? If you're giving your body what it needs, it will naturally sustain you for long periods of time between meals without you feeling like you're going to lose your mind if you don't get your hands on something right that minute. And so I help people understand that what's driving that cycle, what's driving the emotional eating and the hormonal eating and the cravings in between meals and the hangry roller coaster, what's making you hungry and cravey is the ultra-processed foods. They are engineered by well-paid food scientists to be irresistible, to make you hungry and to make you want more. That's how they sell more of these things to you. And so it's not your fault. I say it, it's not your fault that you can't stop thinking about these things, that it's hard to imagine living without them. They're designed to do exactly this to you, and it's a trap. And the truth is you don't need these things. Your body doesn't even want these things, but it can't tell until you step away, step off that roller coaster for a few days. And like you said, really a week or two is where you really start to see the first few days are the worst. But, a week or two before, as you said, your body recalibrates. It finds its new equilibrium and things stabilize and quiet down and you feel more at peace on the inside. And therefore, no matter what's going on the outside, you'll be more stable from within. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a really powerful and empowering concept is to say to people, look, this is not, you're not in control. The food is, the food, I shouldn't even use the word food. These products are controlling you. And wouldn't it be interesting to find out whether that's true for you? Maybe we could do an experiment and see what it feels like.
I really love your perspective and your approach, Georgia. Obviously, you're deeply steeped in science, and also from the way I experience you right now, deeply steeped in compassion. And from what I have learned in the brief time that we've been conversing, your patients are so blessed to be working with you. And this question popped up in my mind. I'd love to hear it from you. And I'm sure other people listening right now would like to know also, and being mindful of the fact that every person is different, but the brain chemistry or how our bodies function is different. But if we can speak in general terms, on the one side for, let's say, people like me who prefer a mainly plant-focused diet, and then also for people who love meat, are carnivores, omnivores, what would be the types of food? And you go in depth into this in your book, of course, but if you can give us a little bit of an overview, what would be some really amazing foods to make sure that are included, and what are the foods you definitely want to get away from?
This is great. And I read about this in the book too, is that I am nutritionally pro-choice. So I really want to respect people's food choices and preferences. And I will help anybody, regardless of their food preferences, to optimize their diet to make it brain healthier. And the good news is that most of these principles are available to everyone, right? And so I think that it's really important. The foods that as you probably know, because it sounds like you read the book or at least are familiar with a lot of what's in the book, in a perfect world, especially under certain circumstances for optimal brain nutrition, I do recommend including at least some animal food in the diet. But I completely understand that for many people, especially for compassionate reasons, that's not going to be an option for them. So I really emphasize careful supplementation and helping people understand, as I'm sure you do as well, which nutrients you need to pay special attention to in terms of supplementation and in terms of meal planning. But that aside, because really the headline here in terms of what do you eat and what you avoid is making sure that you're following whole foods principles, whole foods, minimally processed, the most nutritious ones you can find, and avoiding. So a whole food, the way I define it, because there's a lot of slippery slope out there in terms of that, a whole food doesn't need an ingredient label, right? So it's a single ingredient food that can be a plant or an animal that exists in nature, that a child could walk up to and say, that's a peach, that's a fish, that's a stalk of broccoli, that's a nut. It doesn't need, by law, it doesn't need an ingredient label. Those, if you do nothing else other than stick to whole foods, you're already going to be healthier than 95% of people on the planet. And so that's a really important thing to understand. But the other important thing is, so if you are starting from a more complicated place, if you're starting from a diet that could use a lot of work, then there are a few things that you want to really focus on in terms of starting to clean things up. So in the book, I suggest some strategies where people can restructure their diet from the ground up, but I also include single steps that people can take, because there's some one-at-a-time people out there who, and really wherever you are ready to start there, if you're a one-at-a-time person and you just want to make one change at a time, I've got a list of single changes in the book, and I'm going to share some of these right now, because whether you read the book or not, I want you to know these things. One thing at a time you can start practicing taking away that's going to be worth your time and effort. So the refined carbohydrates, the sugars, the flours, the cereal products, the fruit juices, the crystals, the powders, the liquids, the syrups, all of those. Carbohydrates from whole foods are a completely different beast than carbohydrates in their refined, naked, processed form, right? So all of those crystals and powders and syrups and those all have to go. Whole food sources of carbohydrates, including fruits and starchy vegetables, those are your best bet. The next thing to be aware of, and there's a growing awareness of this, is the so-called vegetable oils, which are really just factory refined, ultra refined oils. So these are things like soybean oil and sunflower oil and corn oil and all of those bottled oils that have no color or flavor. They all come out of gigantic oil refineries and take at least 15 chemical steps to produce. Nothing natural about it. That's very different than obtaining those same oils in their natural form from a whole food like a nut or a seed. Very different story. Those are safe. The vegetable oils are not. Because the vegetable oils, just like sugar and flour and all those sorts of things, promote inflammation and oxidative stress in the brain, which are very damaging. The next thing is alcohol. And I know we don't talk a lot about alcohol when we're talking about food. It's really important. Yeah. This is just as toxic as sugar is. And so it can damage every organ system in the body, including the brain. It's highly addictive for a lot of people. It has absolutely no nutritional value. And it's all risk and no benefit. So it's really important, even though people may have heard out there that, red wine is a brain healthy beverage and it includes all these beautiful, colorful antioxidants. The most famous one is called resveratrol, which is this very dark red, supposedly antioxidant, super chemical, super phytonutrient in red wine that's supposed to be so healthy for us. There is no evidence that this is good for us. So red wine itself has never been tested in human clinical trials for maybe obvious reasons. But resveratrol itself, this molecule that is isolated and concentrated from red wine that's supposed to be so good for us, this molecule has been tested over and over and over again in lots of different clinical trials, all kinds of animal studies and laboratory studies, and no benefits to the brain thus far have been conclusively documented. But even if you think, the jury's out, I'm just going to have some red wine just in case it's good for me, the amount of red wine that you would need to drink to obtain even the lowest dose of resveratrol used in clinical trials is 500 bottles per day. So, I do not recommend it just as a psychiatrist. And so and keeping in mind, even if that resveratrol did have the power to fight off oxidative stress in the brain and protect the brain somehow, that little lonely milligram of resveratrol that's sitting in that glass is surrounded in a sea of alcohol, which is a powerful promoter of oxidative stress, which you're trying to fight with the resveratrol, and that it's not going to work.
Well, and also not only alcohol, that's the issue. First of all, alcohol per se is a depressant.
Yes.
Once in a while, God, it's maybe now every 6 weeks or so, I'll have a glass of wine or two. I haven't had a glass of wine in months, actually. Maybe in winter, once or twice during the holiday season, I'll have a glass of scotch. So that's been my alcohol intake over the last 2-3 years. And I always know, as much as I may enjoy it in a certain situation, I always know it comes with a downside. I won't feel as well emotionally. I won't function as well cognitively. I'll feel sluggish the next day because my body now, of course, reacts to alcohol as what it is, a toxin, right?
Yes.
But the alcohol is not the only issue. There's many years ago, I remember I was talking to a gentleman who was a wine aficionado and just commenting on, oh my gosh, I can go to Europe and I can drink half a bottle or maybe even a bottle of wine over many hours and I feel great the next day. Kind of great. Look, not horrible. And here in the US, I feel horrible. And he educated me, said that is because in the US, as well as in South Africa, South America, Australia, the wine are not as regulated as they are in Europe. And you basically are getting a chemical buzz and not an alcohol buzz. Because on a bottle of wine, for example, you would assume, okay, this is fermented grape juice, a completely natural product from it. Most of the commercial wines that win, this is just wine. I'm not even going into the other spirits. But most of the commercially produced wines are far from a natural product. And if you look at artisanal winemaking, how they process it, what is used, what is not used, it's completely different. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of alcohol either. And I think it's so interesting that in our culture, it plays such an integral part. The advertisements, the glorification in TV and movies. I remember years ago, if you decided to say, no, thank you, I don't want a shot, I'm good, you were looked at, oh, she's weird. That in this culture, you are encouraged to take the drug. If you don't take the drug, something's wrong with you, right? It's become so normalized, which also makes it so difficult for many people to get off it.
It's so true. And this difference in quality and the difference in priorities in terms of how we treat all of our, the way we raise plants and animals around the world. I often notice, you and I were talking before we started recording about both of us having spent time in Europe, and there's a tremendous difference in quality and priorities in terms of how food is grown and food is produced in Europe compared to the United States. And not just about alcohol, but about how plants are grown, how animals are raised. It's really disheartening. I guess that's not a strong enough word. Is that somehow in the United States we've lost, if we don't take care of our environment, that's where food comes from. If we don't take care of the soil, if we don't take care of the water, if we don't take care of the air, if we don't stop polluting everything around us and spraying pesticides on everything and using chemical fertilizers, we are really, I don't know how much longer. I think we're in denial about being able to eat this way for very much longer.
100%, Georgia. And there's a beautiful documentary out there. I think it's called Kiss the Ground with Woody Harrelson that talks exactly about one of the things you just mentioned, topsoil, and the loss of topsoil, the loss of all the nutrients in the soil, and that we may only have about 50 more harvests left that will actually nourish us if we go on in this way. And I do believe we're in if you want to so call it, a mass hypnosis, where we're living within this paradigm where we're not taking care of the earth and we are off the earth. There is no separation. So whatever are not due to the earth will come back to us in some form or another. And part of being in this mass hypnosis, it's also furthered by being in a state of dis-ease caused by these foods that make us sick, that then put us in a loop where we're getting prescribed medications that don't heal us, but that just manage symptoms for many years or decades. So it's about waking up. And that's why I am personally so passionate about mental health, physical health. It's not just about the individual. it filters into your family, your close relatives, or whoever you count as family. It filters into the rest of humanity. It filters into the choices you make for yourself and for others. And it basically shapes the world that we're in. And that's why I also loved when I learned about your work. I think it is so crucial to bring people back to health and into balanced states. The more balanced each and every one of us is, the better for the entire human family and the better for our not only survival. We don't want to just eke by in some kind of dystopian future. We want to all put that together in a beautiful world that this can be, right?
It's just so true. As you were talking, I was thinking, you were saying how it filters through each individual to others. We are social creatures, and so our habits are catchy, right? So who we spend time with and how we eat and how we live, the people that we spend time with, they absorb some of that energy and some of that, I can tell the difference when I'm spending time with people who are more health conscious, rubs off on you, right? Versus if you're spending time with people who are not very health conscious and those habits start to rub off on you. It's just because we're social creatures. And so the better example we can each set in terms of holding ourselves individually to higher standards as best we can. None of us is perfect about this, but understanding which choices are the ones that are going to be most impactful and trying to practice those, and then living as an example for others around us, because that is catchy, even if you don't say a word. In fact, often it's better if you don't say a word, right? Just living by example, and that will rub off. And the other thing you said was this balance, living balanced lifestyle, that got me thinking about how we often hear about, oh, it's important to eat a healthy, balanced diet, a healthy, balanced diet. And the funny thing about ketogenic diets is that they're very unbalanced, but they're profoundly balancing in terms of brain and body metabolism. So it's almost as if you unbalance your diet, it will balance you from within. And it's not about unbalancing. You want the diet to be nutritionally balanced, but in terms of the macronutrients. So in order to get into that fat burning phase, even if it's not all the time, even if it's just intermittently, which for some people is all that needs to happen. Some people don't need to be in ketosis all the time. Some people just need to make sure they're getting there on some kind of a frequent enough basis that they can enter that healing mode and that quiet healing mode and access some of the benefits of that mode. Strangely enough, it's by unbalancing the macronutrients, by really bringing the carbohydrates down quite low and swapping out a lot of those calories for fat calories. It doesn't have to be animal fat. It can also be plant fats. By unbalancing that, leaving the protein has to be adequate, of course. These are not high protein diets. These are moderate, adequate protein diets. But you're just switching from maybe 50-60% carbohydrate, which is what a lot of people eat, and maybe 20-30%. You're just flipping that switch, so the carbs come down, the fat goes up. And by unbalancing the diet this way, the body and brain become more balanced, which sounds wrong, but that's actually how it works.
Yeah, then I can also just speak from my personal experience. When I eat good, healthy type fats, I feel so much better. I'm satiated for a long time. My brain works better. And there's a feeling of calmness. And that's something else that struck me in your book, and you've mentioned it before in this conversation, particularly with regard to the liver, when things quiet down, what you call the quiet diet in your book, which, as I understand it, aims to minimize stress on various bodily systems, which makes it especially interesting for sensitive individuals, right? Be that physically or emotionally. So how can you talk a little bit about this and how that influences, for example, your endocrine system or other systems in the body that actually really help to balance you?
Yes. So the sort of quiet principles, like you said, it's reducing stress on various systems. So some foods are much easier to digest and are much easier for sensitive people to tolerate than others. And so I've in my various recommendations or suggestions about how people can experiment with their diet, one of the things I've done is I've taken out a few things which are more likely to aggravate the gut, aggravate the thyroid, aggravate the immune system, aggravate the nervous system, and aggravate and put too much pressure on your insulin levels, right? So we really want to take pressure off our delicate insulin signaling system, which has just been bombarded with too much food, too often, for too long. And really taking care, that's how we take care of our metabolic health. And our mental health is dependent on good metabolic health. So one way that these plans are quieter than most diets, is that they support lower glucose and insulin levels. So they're lower in carbohydrate. And so that's one way that they're quiet. And so that takes pressure off your insulin signaling system, because the macronutrient, so macronutrients are protein, fat, carbohydrate. The macronutrient that puts the most pressure on insulin, that demands the most insulin for processing, is carbohydrate. And of all the carbohydrates, the ones that are the most demanding are the refined carbohydrates, the naked glucose molecules, the powders and the syrups and the crystals and the liquids, right? So all of these diets ease up on the carbohydrates, and they completely exclude the refined carbohydrates. Another way in which they're quiet is by helping people understand that there are a few plant foods which, especially if you're sensitive or have a mental health issue and you've already cleaned up your diet in other ways, but you're still dealing with a mental health issue, you may want to explore the possibility that certain plant foods and even certain animal foods, which we'll talk about, could be working against you or irritating your nervous system. And one is the nightshades. Nightshades naturally contain small amounts of neurotoxic chemicals that the plant uses to defend itself. And so some of us are much more sensitive to these than others, but what they can do is they can cause chronic pain syndromes like aches and pains, burning sensations in the feet and hands sometimes, depression, anxiety, heartburn. They're very aggravating of the nervous system, and especially if you've got gut health issues or immune system issues, or again, any kind of mental health issue that hasn't responded to whatever improvements you've already tried to make to your diet, it's worth experimenting with taking the nightshades out. And the nightshades are, by the way, they are the peppers, eggplant, tomatoes, white potato skins, and goji berries. So
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that either till I researched it a few years ago when I did a deep dive. Isn't that funny? And so these foods, they don't look necessarily like they're in the same family, but the fruits of each one of these plants all have the same little elfish green hat on top. If you picture a tomato, it's got that little elf hat on top. The fruits of potatoes, we don't eat the fruits of potatoes. Fruits of potatoes have that hat. The goji berries have that hat. And the eggplant, if you can imagine, the eggplant has that little elf hat on top. Those are all nightshades. I think it's adorable. But anyway, it's worth experimenting with that, maybe taking those out for a week or two, seeing if you feel any different. Another plant food that I advise people to step away from if they're trying to improve their mental health and other things haven't worked is cassava root. Mm-hmm. And we're starting to see this more and more of the processed packaged foods as a gluten-free starch substitute. But cassava contains, especially if it isn't properly prepared and it's hard to know whether it is or not, trace amounts of cyanide, which poisons the mitochondria, which are our energy. The mitochondria do lots of things, but one of the things they do in all of our cells is generate energy. And the brain is an energy hog, and it must have optimal mitochondrial health to function at its best, to generate all the energy that we need. And so cassava root, again, these are suggestions for people who want to go deeper. Mm-hmm. They've already tried a healthy whole foods diet of whatever base they wish. Maybe they're not getting as far as they hoped and they want more benefits or seeking more benefits. These are some examples of changes that you can make that may be useful.
Outstanding. Yes, and I'll do a deeper dive into goji berries and cassava. These are particularly fascinating for me. I had no idea. And to tie up this really fascinating conversation, Georgia, and to inspire the listeners, could you share some real-world examples or maybe case studies from your practice where dietary interventions have significantly improved patient outcomes, and how?
Yes, there's so many stories. I share quite a few stories in the book as well, but I also have many stories from my own practice. So one story I'll share with you, which is relatively recent, a few months ago, a man with a young family with bipolar disorder for many years, taking several medications, and had never really been able to get on top of the anxiety and depression that he'd been dealing with, switched to a ketogenic diet. And within 3.5 weeks, started to feel better than he had in 15, 20 years. And to the point that his wife noticed, his coworkers noticed, he, of course, himself noticed. And it was just, and was able to start reducing his medications. It's a very recent case. And he said to me, and I love this quote, it's so lovely, I wish I'd come up with it myself. But he said, maybe there's nothing wrong with me. Maybe there's something wrong with my diet. Maybe there's just, and that's such a powerful statement. What if, who knows how many people this may be true for, what if the only thing for some people out there that's causing their mental health issue is their diet? That's not going to be true for everybody, but what if for someone out there, that's all it takes? And I see this all the time in my practice. The majority of people in my practice who improve their dietary habits in certain ways, most of them improve to a meaningful extent. And we're talking hundreds of people that I've worked with over the years who have applied a lot of these strategies to their lives. So which changes are the ones that are most worth focusing on? So it's not about putting more blueberries on top of your oatmeal or drinking more red wine or eating more dark chocolate. Those aren't the strategies that are going to help you. If you understand which ones changes are most worth making and why, you can make significant improvements in your mental health. So another example, and I share this example because it's not a perfect example and it's an ongoing case. There's a woman in her 70s who I've been working with for 4 or 5 years now. For 30 or 40 years, has needed to be hospitalized twice a year like clockwork for recurrent manic episodes. She has bipolar disorder, but just one pole. So she doesn't really get depressed. She just becomes manic. And that's one type of bipolar disorder that a person can have. And she's essentially been disabled by this condition for most of her adult life. And as she was getting older, she was also developing some symptoms of psychosis, meaning paranoia. She would become, if she would lose an item in her apartment, she lives alone in an apartment building. And if she'd lost an item in her building, she would call her daughter and say that she couldn't find this item. And her daughter would say, Mom, maybe you misplaced it. You might want to take a look for it. And she would say, oh, no, someone broke in. So some people are always breaking in. They're always breaking in and taking my things. And she was just absolutely convinced that this was the case, to the point that the daughter installed cameras in the apartment to try to reassure her mother that this was not happening. And it didn't help. This was a really concrete belief that she had. And she wasn't sleeping and her mind was racing and lots of bipolar symptoms. So in any case, her daughter, after her mother had been hospitalized for several months and they really couldn't do much more with the medications, had been optimized. She was taking 2 antipsychotic medications, one at a very high dose. She came out of the hospital and the daughter said, do you think that a ketogenic diet could help my mother? And I always say to everybody, I've learned to say this, I don't know. Let's find out what's possible together, right? Because I don't want to overpromise, but I also don't want to sell somebody short. Inside, I'm thinking, I don't know. This is it's a chronic case. It's someone who's much older, in her 70s, a very serious case. 2 weeks after starting the ketogenic diet, mood improved, her anxiety came down, her sleep improved, her cognition improved, the paranoia melted away. And if she misplaced something in the apartment, she'd call her daughter would say, maybe you misplaced something. She said, oh, you're probably right. Let me take a look for it, right? And we were eventually able to completely remove, very carefully and slowly over time, remove the antipsychotic, the very, very high dose antipsychotic, and replace it with something much gentler at a much lower dose. And this is an example. If somebody who has struggled for this long with serious, disabling, chronic mental illness for 40 years can benefit in 2 to 3 weeks from a ketogenic diet, imagine what that can do for somebody with mild mood swings or a little bit of anxiety or irritability. It's a very powerful intervention. And it really, I've seen it help people time and time again in ways no medicine can. And so I wrote the book to make these strategies accessible for people. So not just everyday people who are trying to help themselves or a family member, but clinicians and nutrition professionals, so that everybody understands how it works and why it makes sense to consider it, and to help people understand that it's not about how many plants or animals you eat. It's not about eating dairy fat. In fact, I'm a huge advocate for removing dairy from the diet. There's a whole half chapter about that. I think, I hope, and so far this is the feedback I'm getting, is that people are finding it useful. They are finding it hopeful. And they are using the information in the book to change their diets or their own diets or family members' diets or diets of their patients or clients, and it's helping. So that's the real test of the book, is to see whether or not it actually works in the real world. And most of the feedback I've been getting has been really reassuring about that.
Beautiful. Beautiful, Georgia. I am so grateful for this incredible body of work you're putting out there and alleviating so much unnecessary suffering. For people who would like to learn more about you or connect with you in any way or form, how can they do so?
Probably the simplest connection point to offer would be the website, which is called diagnosisdiet.com. Or people can just Google my name, which is Georgia Ede. EDE is my last name, and the website, and it'll pop up because it's an unusual name. And there's lots of information there. There's a clinician directory free to search if you're looking for a clinician to help you. It's really important not to just start a ketogenic diet without consulting with a specialist first, because it is a powerful intervention and can be dangerous if you don't know how to navigate the first few weeks with some support. So there's a free clinician directory. There are links on the website to my clinician training program if you have clinicians who are listening. And there's information about the book. And there's lots and lots of free articles and information and links to more resources on the website. I guess that's the best place to start.
Super. Thank you so much, Georgia. And thank you for making time today and coming on the podcast. I so appreciate it. This was a great conversation.
I've really enjoyed it, Ariane. I really enjoyed meeting you. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak with your listeners.
It was my pleasure.